The voice that had always been relentlessly vocal, the instrument that had never once surrendered a syllable, abruptly and inexplicably ceased to function. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was squarely positioned in the precise middle of a complex sentence, rapidly ascending toward the sweeping rhetorical crescendo she always aimed for when the cameras were rolling. Her hands were animating her words in that highly signature, meticulously practiced style, moving in that specific, sweeping manner perfectly calibrated for the multitude of lenses recording her every micro-expression. She was undeniably dominating the room. Anyone present in that auditorium could look at her and immediately sense that her victory was imminent. And then, for the very first time that entire morning, J.D. Vance leaned his body closer to his microphone. He spoke a mere handful of words, 7 words to be exact, and the elaborate, towering argument she was constructing completely shattered in her throat, collapsing violently like a grand house whose foundational pillars had just been mercilessly kicked away from beneath it. To genuinely comprehend exactly how a brief sentence unraveled 40 continuous minutes of the most flawlessly rehearsed political theater in modern American politics, one must rewind the clock back to the very start of the hearing. Back to the moment when she still assumed he was an opponent not even worth worrying about. This specific event wasn't designed to be Vance's moment in the spotlight. It was entirely her orchestrated stage, meant to belong exclusively to her. She had aggressively lobbied for this congressional hearing, handpicked the geographical location, and adamantly insisted on traveling to Ohio specifically. She desperately wanted to plant herself directly in the heart of the Rust Belt, to project an aura of total empathy and tell the region that she intimately understood their struggles. And there she was, executing her master plan, perfectly stationed behind a cheap, collapsible folding table inside a remarkably unglamorous community college lecture hall in the city of Dayton. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed and hummed incessantly, casting a pale glow over an audience of 200 working-class locals who had driven in from forgotten, dilapidated municipalities that the national media networks had long abandoned, because nothing sensational or noteworthy ever happened in them anymore. "Let me speak plainly and honestly with you," she began, infusing her tone with an apparent warmth. It was real warmth, or at least a highly convincing simulation of something that sounded close enough to warmth to comfort a room filled with rigid, uncomfortable plastic seating. "I am acutely aware of the narratives and the stories that people have been told regarding the Green New Deal. I recognize the exaggerated caricatures. However, I traveled out here today because the hardworking individuals sitting in this auditorium are owed a genuine, substantive dialogue regarding what happens to our future next. Not what happened in the past, but what comes next. Because here is the harsh, uncomfortable reality that no politician seeking electoral office in this state is willing to vocalize out loud. Those massive steel factories are not returning," she declared. "The coal-fired power plants are gone for good. That manufacturing factory floor where your father clocked in, and his father clocked in before him, that floor isn't going to be rebuilt or relayed. And I realize this is exceptionally difficult to absorb. I know it's particularly tough to hear in this specific room, in this exact city, within this very state. Yet, desperately clinging to those bygone industrial sectors is akin to holding onto a heavy typewriter during the digital age of the internet. It may be a beautifully crafted machine, and I deeply respect the profound nostalgia attached to it. But nostalgia does not constitute a viable economic policy." She delivered these scripted lines with the supreme self-assurance of an individual imparting a harsh but necessary historical truth. It was the specific brand of boldness derived from assuming you are fundamentally courageous for voicing what others actively avoid. Had she been standing in a wealthy Washington, D.C. boardroom, flanked by political aides who spoke her exact vocabulary and shared her elite zip code, it might have successfully landed as an act of profound courage. But she wasn't in the nation's capital. She was in Dayton, Ohio. And seated conspicuously in the third row was an older gentleman wearing a faded canvas jacket adorned with the embroidered emblem of a defunct steel corporation, a company that had been bankrupt for years. His calloused hands had just gone visibly white as he gripped his knees, reacting physically to the woman at the front of the room, essentially dismissing the entirety of his life's labor as an antiquated typewriter. For 30 uninterrupted minutes, AOC commanded the venue flawlessly. A pair of allied senators tossed her perfectly teed-up inquiries regarding green energy funding and vocational retraining initiatives. She rattled off comprehensive responses with the smooth, rapid-fire articulation of a seasoned politician who had tackled those identical prompts 100 times prior because she absolutely had. She cited peer-reviewed academic research. She pointed to specific drafted legislation. She appeared highly intelligent, thoroughly briefed, and perfectly composed. And not once during that entire duration did she cast a single glance toward the man seated at the far edge of the panel, who hadn't uttered a solitary syllable since the session officially commenced. J.D. Vance remained seated quietly, his hands resting passively atop a cheap, unbranded notepad, the flimsy kind you purchase at a rural gas station for $2, sporting a generic cardboard front and a fractured, glued binding. He wasn't jotting down frantic thoughts during her monologue. He offered absolutely no physical or emotional reaction to her lengthy statements. He occupied his chair with the profound, heavy stillness of someone accustomed to environments where remaining motionless isn't merely a sign of patience, but a strict form of survival discipline, a harsh setting where you train yourself to inhale and exhale at a deliberate cadence that masks your strategic intentions. The surrounding senators concluded their inquiries, received their scripted feedback, and reorganized their scattered documents. Vance simply existed in the quiet, and the deliberate nothingness he projected began, very slowly, to generate a palpable, undeniable gravity within the auditorium. Eventually, the committee chairman deferred to him, and the heavy stillness fractured. Vance angled himself forward, not with dramatic or theatrical flair, but just enough for the sensitive audio equipment to register his physical shift. "Congresswoman," he initiated, his voice steady, "I'd like to begin by finding common ground and agreeing with you." She pivoted her chair to face him, and a brief, unmistakable flash of something crossed her features. Perhaps it was astonishment, or the sudden, jarring mental recalibration one experiences when bracing for a physical punch but receiving an open handshake instead. "You stated that the blue-collar working class has been left behind and abandoned. You are absolutely correct. I grew up deep within the middle of that very reality. Therefore, I am not going to argue with you about whether the underlying problem exists." He offered a single, measured nod, slowly executing the gesture. "I merely wish to pose a few questions regarding it. Very minor inquiries, highly specific ones." "Of course," she replied automatically. "A few moments ago, you utilized the term relic. You likened the regional steel facilities to typewriters, and you directed that specific comparison to the folks sitting in this very room. I want to guarantee I am interpreting your words correctly. Are you declaring to the citizens of Dayton, Ohio, that their foundational steel industry is merely a typewriter?" AOC adjusted her posture slightly, sensing the trap. "I am pointing out that the economic landscape is shifting, Senator. That isn't a controversial political stance. That is simply basic economics. However, you didn't say the word shifting. You said typewriter. You used the word relic. Those were your exact phrases. I was merely employing a metaphor. I am completely aware. I heard it. So did every single individual sitting right there in the third row." He didn't cast a glance toward the audience. He had absolutely no reason to. "My inquiry isn't regarding figurative language or metaphors. My inquiry pertains to fundamental respect, because there is a gentleman seated right over there whose hands carry deep scars from a steel mill scars that are significantly older than your entire career in politics. And you just relegated his life's profession to an artifact in a museum piece. Consequently, I want to know, Congresswoman, do you wish to walk that specific terminology back, or do you fiercely stand by it?" The entire atmosphere in the space had transformed. It wasn't a boisterous or loud shift. It resembled a massive river whose subterranean current violently alters course beneath the surface. The water looks identically calm from above, but the deadly reality below is entirely different. AOC absolutely refused to retract the statement. That was her defining, unyielding trait. The very characteristic her base wildly adored and her fiercest detractors could never forgive. She never, under any circumstances, retreated or walked things back. "I firmly stand by the factual reality, Senator. Economic systems aggressively evolve. Laborers are deeply entitled to an equitable, just transition. That is precisely what I am formally proposing." Vance nodded in slow acknowledgement. "Okay, so let us delve into this just transition. Let's get highly specific. When a manufacturing plant completely shuts its doors and a worker abruptly loses their job, exactly how long does their COBRA medical insurance coverage last?" A brief, noticeable fraction of a second passed in complete silence. It wasn't long enough for the casual observer to register, but it was agonizingly long enough for anyone paying acute attention to feel the devastating stumble. She did not know the answer. The significantly more pressing issue than the duration of COBRA is why we fundamentally operate within a framework where healthcare access is tethered to one's employer in the first place. She attempted to deflect. Vance vehemently refused to let her redirect the narrative and finish the thought. 18 months, he stated clearly. COBRA runs for 18 months, assuming they can even manage the exorbitant monthly premiums. The typical family rate for COBRA sits at roughly $1,700 every single month. The vast majority of recently unemployed workers cannot possibly pay that. AOC attempted to forcefully interject. That is the exact reason we must... But Vance pushed forward with relentless momentum. His volume didn't aggressively increase. His tone merely solidified into something much steadier. Following those 18 months, if they haven't reached the age of 65, they plummet directly into a massive coverage gap. They are far too young to qualify for Medicare, far too financially drained for commercial private insurance, yet their previous income disqualifies them from Medicaid in numerous states. What is your concrete, actionable plan for that specific gap? Not the grand, overarching legislative vision, not the campaign podium speech. What is the solution for that gap? For that specific individual next month, AOC defensively squared her shoulders and straightened up. I have formally put forth legislation for Medicare for All which would entirely eliminate that gap. Medicare for All lacks the necessary votes to even pass out of your own committee, Congresswoman. I am inquiring about the immediate present. Right now, next month, the citizen trapped in that terrifying gap. What is your direct message to them? Don't address the television cameras, address them. AOC leaned aggressively closer to her microphone. I assure them that I am battling every single day to construct the systemic framework that would safeguard them. Vance tilted his head slightly, perfectly mimicking the kind of curious tilt a hound makes when it registers a sound frequency it does not recognize. Battling to construct. Those are phrases rooted entirely in the future tense, Congresswoman. She loses her medical safety net in 30 days. Exactly 30. She relies on a specific prescription she fills every single month for a chronic ailment she never asked for. The local pharmacy counter does not accept battling to construct as a valid form of payment. What is her immediate recourse on day 31? She absolutely shouldn't be forced to face that agonizing choice, and that is precisely the point I am arguing. But she does face it, right now, today, within this very postal code, very likely sitting in this very auditorium. A woman seated 4 rows back nervously adjusted her physical position, causing her plastic seat to groan loudly. Within the hushed, breathless silence of the auditorium, that simple creak resonated almost identically like a spoken word. AOC pressed her lips into a thin, tense line. She was vastly unaccustomed to this brutal arena. She thrived in conceptual debates conducted at an altitude of 30,000 feet, where the landscape looked pristine and clean, and the gritty, painful details were minimized. Vance was aggressively dragging her down to the muddy ground floor, the perilous intersection where theoretical governance physically collides with a kitchen table, a towering mountain of overdue notices, and a prescription bottle bearing a price tag that induces absolute tremors in a person's hands. And she severely lacked a navigational map for that rugged terrain. The quiet lingered just long enough for a gentleman in the rear row to exhale heavily and frustratedly through his nostrils, a subtle, sharp noise that the room's acoustic architecture broadcasted much further than he intended. It wasn't merely a sigh, it was the auditory manifestation of a human being who had endured that exact crisis, lived entirely inside that terrifying question, and just watched an elite politician spectacularly fail to answer it. AOC reverted to her absolute strongest tactic, doing what AOC fundamentally does best. She completely abandoned her failing defensive posture and aggressively launched an offensive assault. And when she went on the attack, it was a genuinely remarkable spectacle to behold. Senator, I must say I truly admire the debate technique. Pose microscopic, hyper-specific inquiries to ensure we never actually tackle the massive systemic answers. Highly clever. However, let us discuss the systemic reality for a brief moment. You authored a highly publicized book regarding destitution in Ohio. It became a massive commercial bestseller. Hollywood even adapted it into a blockbuster movie. You amassed significant, life-changing wealth from that endeavor. Subsequently, you relocated across the country to San Francisco. You secured employment under Peter Thiel, a billionaire tech mogul, engaging in ruthless venture capitalism. You funneled massive investments into the exact technological enterprises that are actively replacing and destroying the blue-collar professions you so eloquently wrote about. Therefore, as you sit here and interrogate my knowledge of COBRA regulations, I implore the audience in this room to reflect on a very serious question. While Senator Vance occupied those elite corporate boardrooms in San Francisco, was his mind focused on Middletown every single day? Or did he only recall his roots when he needed to run for a political office? She dramatically swept her gaze across the attendees, perfectly employing the physical vocabulary of an actor finding her ideal spotlight. Because I have proudly served in Congress for 6 years, and without fail, every single day, I have shown up and fought tooth and nail for the citizens who lack the funds to hire a corporate lobbyist. Every single day. Where exactly was the senator residing? San Francisco. It connected. The impact was undeniable, and you could physically feel it land in the room. Several audience members offered affirming, supportive nods. A young lady seated near the peripheral aisle applauded briefly twice before catching herself. The energetic momentum violently shifted, and for a fleeting, powerful window, it belonged entirely to AOC, and she knew it. That knowing made her adopt a more commanding, taller posture, which in turn amplified the audience's belief in her narrative even further. Vance remained completely stoic. He didn't react. 2 agonizing seconds elapsed. Then 3. "Congresswoman," he finally stated, "you are completely right." The atmosphere stalled and paused once more. I did relocate to San Francisco. I did occupy comfortable seats in those boardrooms. And I vividly, painfully recall one specific evening. The exact night is seared into my memory. I was eating dinner at an establishment where the final bill was significantly more than my own mother earned in an entire week. He paused deliberately. Back when she was still earning. Those 3 final words hung like lead in the room. When she was still earning. Nobody required the completion of that dark sentence. Everybody fundamentally heard and understood the implication anyway. And I stared down at that expensive plate, and my mind drifted directly to my grandmother's modest, cramped kitchen back in Middletown. We ate red beans and rice, not out of some culinary preference because she liked it, but simply because that is the only option she had. He locked eyes intensely with AOC. The very next week, I started packing cardboard boxes. I moved back home. Not claiming I am some inherently virtuous or good person, but simply because I couldn't physically stand the emotional distance anymore. Then his vocal tone radically shifted. It didn't elevate in volume, rather a distinct, piercing chill permeated his words, creeping in exactly the way frost aggressively moves across a window pane slowly, and then all at once. You questioned if Middletown was on my mind every single day. The honest, blunt answer is no. Not every day. But I ultimately went back. And it makes me genuinely wonder, Congresswoman, when you departed the Met Gala at midnight back in September of 2021, draped in a custom designer gown emblazoned with the phrase, "Tax the Rich," while attending an exclusive, luxurious party that cost $35,000 for a single entry ticket, did you actually think about the Bronx, or did you merely think about the social media caption? A collective sharp sound rippled through the entire room. It wasn't exactly laughter. It was far more piercing and brutal than that. It was the quick, unified intake of breath from 200 individuals processing a sentence they were utterly unprepared to hear. The specific kind of sound triggered when someone voices the exact critique everyone had privately formulated but had politely filed away as too uncivil to utter in public. The visual of the Met Gala was instantly resurrected and glowing in their heads. Every single one of them had seen the photographs, and Vance didn't have to explain it or describe the dress. He merely needed to utter the single word, caption. And the whole memory lit up brightly. The pristine white fabric, the bold red letters, the overflowing champagne, and the woman who branded herself a democratic socialist standing dead in the middle of all of it, smiling broadly. The dialogue had rapidly transcended legislative details and bypassed standard biography. It had descended into the visceral, deeply personal domain where identity lives, and AOC navigated that exact territory better than almost anyone else in American politics. Vance maintained his pressure, his voice remaining deeply resonant and low. "Congresswoman, you frequently highlight and say you are from the Bronx. I am fully aware you were born there. However, I am also aware because it is basic public record that your family permanently relocated to Yorktown Heights when you were merely 5 years of age. You attended Yorktown High School. Yorktown, situated in affluent Westchester County. AOC retaliated and came back instantly, lightning fast. My mother scrubbed toilets and cleaned houses in Yorktown specifically so I could access that educational system. My family desperately pooled their meager money to buy a small house. I do not need you auditing my residential address history. I am not conducting an audit of your address. I am posing a legitimate question. When you stand before the people in this venue and declare that you intimately understand working-class life, which specific experience are you actually drawing from? Yorktown Heights, an area boasting a 95% high school graduation rate? Or somewhere else entirely? Are you seriously attempting to gatekeep the concept of poverty now, Senator? Is there only one acceptable kind of hard? No, there are many kinds of hard, but you seem to claim a singular narrative, and it simply does not match the reality of Yorktown Heights. My mother donned yellow rubber gloves 6 days a week just so I could occupy a desk in a quality classroom. Do not presume to tell me what matches my reality. I am not critiquing your mother. Your mother labored immensely, and I hold profound respect for that. I am talking directly about you, about the manufactured brand, the girl from the Bronx. You moved away from the Bronx when you were 5 years old, Congresswoman. You were educated in a heavily funded suburban high school in Westchester County, where your peers referred to you as Sandy. And then you enrolled at Boston University, and somewhere along the trajectory between Yorktown Heights and your debut campaign video, Sandy miraculously morphed into Alexandria from the Bronx, and absolutely nobody was supposed to notice the massive distance. That is a shockingly grotesque simplification of my deeply personal story. It is a chronological timeline. Timelines lack complexity. They progress in exactly one direction. The verbal sparring had accelerated dramatically now. One rapid sentence, 2 sentences flying back and forth. It was the distinct rhythm of 2 combatants who had abandoned their theatrical performances for the audience and were now speaking directly to one another's core. And the room was watching with the rapt attention of a crowd observing a street fight, where both participants have stopped circling and moved directly into the center of the ring. Then Vance executed a maneuver absolutely nobody anticipated. He stopped. He completely stopped talking about the Bronx, completely stopped talking about Yorktown, and he directed his gaze outward toward the audience, looking right past AOC. His voice dropped to a quiet register that compelled the entire room to go completely quiet in tandem with it. But you know what, Congresswoman? I truly do not care where you grew up. I care about something else entirely. He was heavily scanning the rows of onlookers now. I have 3 kids, Ewan, Vivek, and Mirabelle. Last night I called my home, and my oldest boy, he is 6. He asked me what I was doing on my schedule today. I informed him I was going to talk to a congresswoman. He then asked me a very simple question. He asked, "Does she help us?" Vance slowly turned back to face AOC. I lacked an answer. I didn't know what to tell him. I honestly don't know if your actions help us or not, but I do know this. When he grows up here in Ohio, I desperately want him to live in a country where the people who represent him intimately know what health insurance actually costs. Not because they skimmed a policy briefing, but because they have physically had to choose between paying for it and paying the electric bill to keep the lights on. That is the fundamental difference I am talking about, Congresswoman. It's not about where you were born, it's about whether you've ever truly had to choose. The auditorium fell deathly still. The worker in the 3rd row hadn't moved an inch, yet his jaw was set tight in a novel way it hadn't been set before. And adjacent to him, an older woman with graying hair pulled tight into a bun was staring at AOC with an expression that wasn't exactly anger, but something significantly closer to profound recognition, the devastating face of someone who has just seen the clear outline of a shape they had long suspected, but never fully confirmed. AOC was far from done. Give her this immense credit because it mattered. She was absolutely not done. And what she articulated next was undeniably the strongest thing she had said all morning, and it very nearly worked. She seemed to grow taller, not physically standing, she was already standing, but an internal, fundamental realignment of her posture reorganized itself. It was something ancient, highly practiced, and legitimately earned. And when she finally spoke, the political performance completely fell away. What remained was a woman fiercely convicted of her own righteousness. Senator, you just weaponized and brought your own children into a congressional hearing. I fiercely refrain from doing that. Do you want to know why? Because I deeply respect the boundary line between family and politics. However, if you insist on talking about the next generation, let us proceed. Her vocal tone was unwavering now, devoid of defensiveness, brimming with absolute certainty. When I first arrived in Congress, absolutely nobody in that entire building was talking about the crushing burden of childcare costs. Nobody was talking about student debt relief. Nobody was talking about insulin price caps. I personally put those concepts directly on the table. You are free to dislike the way I talk. You can completely dislike where I grew up. You can sneer at the dress I wore, but when you Google insulin price cap, you will immediately find my name attached to that legislation, not yours. She allowed a deliberate pause, then delivered a counterstrike that nearly ended his entire argument. You wrote a book about the massive problem. I wrote structural laws about the problem. Books sit on shelves collecting dust. Laws change people's lives. Therefore, tell me, Senator who is truly sitting down with them. The room's equilibrium tilted violently. She had dismantled his foundational argument, the exact ideological architecture he had been meticulously building all morning. The premise that real empathy requires lived experience over podium speeches, and completely flipped it on its head. And her counter was not hollow. The push for insulin caps was a factual reality. The childcare legislation was real. She possessed a tangible legislative history, a genuine record, and she had just slammed it onto the table, openly daring him to match it. An aide positioned directly behind her nodded vigorously. Someone seated near the back clapped loudly. The energetic momentum belonged to her. For an agonizing, long 5 seconds, Vance remained completely frozen. And this time, the stillness didn't resemble disciplined patience. It mirrored a climber desperately scrambling to find the next handhold on a rock wall. He had not expected to be this terrifyingly steep. Vance was quiet significantly longer than before, long enough that portions of the crowd began accepting and settling into the narrative that she had won the exchange. Long enough that AOC's rigid posture visibly relaxed half an inch, mimicking the exact way a prizefighter drops their guard when they assume the round is definitively theirs. Then he offered a slow, deliberate nod, echoing the exact same motion he used when he first feigned agreement at the beginning. Instantly, the audience, without fully understanding exactly why, felt the tension snap and tighten back into place. Congresswoman, your point regarding insulin is entirely valid. I will eagerly give you that. You forced the conversation. I will never dispute it. He permitted the concession to hang in the air, establishing his reasonableness. Then he leaned heavily into the microphone. However, you just articulated a philosophy that I need you to hear back. You declared, books sit on shelves, laws change lives. I concur completely. Therefore, allow me to logically ask you, your signature Green New Deal, you debuted that resolution back in 2019. We are currently in 2024 now. Has that document become codified law? AOC's eyes narrowed dangerously. It was structured as a resolution, and the machinery of the legislative process takes immense time. Has it successfully become law? The constant partisan obstruction from your side of the aisle has severely blocked. Has it become law, Congresswoman? No. Your Medicare for All initiative, you were a primary co-author. Has it achieved legal status? You are fully aware of the political answers. Your federal jobs guarantee proposal, is it currently law? Dead, heavy silence. The $15 federal minimum wage. You heavily championed it. Is it law? More crushing silence. Vance allowed the quiet to stretch indefinitely. He refused to fill it. He permitted every single voter in that space to mentally tally up those grand proposals in their head and independently arrive at the exact same brutal mathematical conclusion. Because a truth a person deduces on their own is a truth they will absolutely believe. Congresswoman, my intention is not to publicly embarrass you. Several of those proposals are conceptually sound ideas. I even align with a few of them personally. But you stood right there, a mere 10 seconds ago, and instructed me that books merely sit on shelves while actual laws transform lives. Those were your explicit words, your chosen framework. So I am compelled to ask, based on your own rigorous standard by the very yardstick you just established to measure my worth, where exactly do we stand? AOC parted her lips to formulate an immediate rebuttal, but halted completely. not because she was forcibly muted, but because she instantly mapped out the conversational trajectory, and every possible avenue circled right back to the exact same damning conclusion. "My published book resides on a shelf," Vance stated softly. "Over 3 million copies of it. And your legislative bills, Congresswoman?" He paused for maximum impact. "They are resting on shelves too, the exact same shelf, right alongside my book." A profound auditory wave washed completely over the room. It wasn't the sharp, surprised gasp from earlier. It was a heavier, much deeper sound. The acoustic equivalent of puzzle pieces snapping into their final configuration. The satisfying click of a rusted key finally turning the tumblers of a stubborn lock, permanently altering what every door in the facility does. Vance stared directly at her, and his subsequent words lacked any polish of rehearsal. They carried the raw authenticity of a sentence that arrived organically because the flow of the debate had carried him directly to it. Exactly the way a river deposits a heavy stone on the precise spot of the shoreline without any conscious direction. The fundamental distinction between you and me isn't about who authored what document. The distinction is that I harbor no illusions. I am fully aware my memoir didn't structurally fix or change anything. I know that as a fact. That realization is why I returned home. It's why I campaigned for public office. It's why I am sitting in this room. He let the words breathe. You operate under the delusion that you've reshaped society simply because you've delivered eloquent speeches regarding the reshaping of society. And those constitute two vastly different realities, Congresswoman. Delivering rhetoric and executing action are fundamentally separate universes. And every working-class citizen in this auditorium recognizes the difference because they are forced to live that difference every single day. Nobody applauded. Nobody laughed. The atmosphere plunged into a depth far below the realm of vocal reaction, entering the silent, heavy space where voters fundamentally alter their allegiances and make permanent decisions. The steelworker in the third row finally unclasped his rigid grip, resting his palms flat against his denim-clad knees facing downward. It was the physical release of an individual who had just witnessed someone articulate the exact sentiment they had waited decades to hear vocalized out loud. AOC opened her mouth to speak. She initiated her defense in her customary fashion, employing the exact pronoun that had launched tens of thousands of sentences on the congressional floor, fueled hundreds of social media broadcasts, and anchored every address she had delivered since the magical night she won her primary in a district she was never supposed to win. "Senator, She managed two distinct words, merely two, and right on the second syllable her vocal register completely fractured. It wasn't a weeping sob, nor a dramatic choke. It was a micro-fissure, exceptionally sharp and clean, the type of fracture that splinters a sheet of glass when the ambient temperature drops too abruptly. Her throat muscles involuntarily tightened for a fraction of a second, snapping the word completely in half. The highly sensitive microphone captured every single frequency of the malfunction, broadcasting it through the PA speakers and into the motionless air of the hall, where 200 onlookers absorbed it and immediately comprehended its terrifying significance. She halted, she drew a deep breath, she attempted it once more. A solitary word this time, desperately grasping for the remainder of her thought process. Exactly the way a blind hand reaches frantically for a banister in pitch darkness. The fracture reappeared at the exact same juncture, on the identical pronoun, the I. It was as though the persona she had meticulously crafted, the impenetrable armor that had shielded her across every elite threshold she had ever crossed, the intellect that had never once experienced a deficit of vocabulary, had suddenly concluded right in front of an audience of disillusioned Ohioans and a native son who had returned that it simply refused to vocalize any longer. The tragedy wasn't found in what she spoke. It resided entirely in what her own throat prohibited her from saying. AOC had faced aggressive attempts to silence her previously countless times, in fact. She had endured aggressive shouting matches in the legislative chambers, faced rude interruptions during committee hearings, suffered intense mockery from conservative news anchors, and been caricatured into a myriad of distorted versions of herself that she barely recognized. She had suffered misquotes, endured physical threats, and been instructed to go back to where she came from by individuals who understood her origins just as poorly as she occasionally seemed to. Absolutely none of those external forces had ever managed to extinguish her voice. She had constructed an entire political empire upon the foundational premise that her voice was an unstoppable, unyielding force. It served as her primary instrument, her offensive weapon, her ultimate proof of existence. And not once throughout 6 grueling years navigating the most exposed existence in modern American politics had it simply refused to work. But this scenario was fundamentally unique. This wasn't an external adversary suppressing her. This was her internal physiology overriding her conscious mind, deciding autonomously that no combination of words remained that could possibly undo the stark reality that had just settled permanently over the auditorium. The final verdict hadn't been delivered by a ballot box, nor by a judicial judge. It had been silently handed down by 200 individuals occupying cheap plastic seating, who had just observed a prominent figure from New York equate their generational labor to a typewriter, and then spectacularly failed to explain how they survive on day 31. The committee chairman allowed 3 agonizing seconds of silence to pass before softly and gently inquiring if the congresswoman cared to provide a response. She offered a single minor shake of her head. By the exact moment the proceedings officially adjourned, the digital footage was already going viral online. Yet, the segment that voters relentlessly shared wasn't the final, crushing intellectual victory. It wasn't the brilliant phrasing contrasting speech and action. It was a mere 2-second audio clip, the pronoun I fracturing apart, followed by a second, identical break. This tragic loop was immediately juxtaposed side by side with a triumphant clip from the congressional floor 6 months prior, where AOC, standing tall with her palm raised, her voice ringing beautifully off the historic marble, famously declared, "I will not be silenced." It was the identical voice stemming from the identical woman, but occupying a vastly different room. And the profound gulf separating those two environments represented the vast, terrifying distance between a political stage and harsh reality. 200 residents of Dayton, Ohio had just witnessed her horrifying realization of which exact platform she was currently standing on. The blue-collar worker from the 3rd row didn't head straight to his residence. He lingered inside his vehicle in the asphalt parking lot. The motor remained off. His hands rested firmly atop the steering wheel, hands bearing deep, permanent scarring across the knuckles, the physical toll of 3 decades of grinding work that an affluent politician from New York had just dismissed as an obsolete typewriter. He stared down at those hands in the quiet for an extended period. Eventually, he retrieved his mobile device and dialed his son's number. He didn't discuss the political clash. He made absolutely no mention of AOC, nor Vance, nor healthcare proposals, nor any of the dramatic theater that had unfolded inside the building. He posed a single, grounded inquiry. "How is the boy doing today?" "He's fine," his son replied. The boy was doing fine. "Is good," the man murmured. He remained parked there for an additional minute, peering silently through the glass windshield at the mundane scenery of a Midwestern community college, long before he finally reached down and turned the key. J.D. Vance exited the facility through a discreet lateral doorway. There were no aggressive journalists, no flashing camera lenses crowding the corridor hallway. He simply folded the cheap notebook shut and slid it seamlessly into his jacket pocket. That same gas station notepad with the ruined spine that had remained open, yet entirely unreferenced throughout the entire morning. He hadn't needed it because the vital truths he had weaponized hadn't been sourced from its blank pages. They were drawn directly from the long drives into town, the quiet drives home, and the heavy years lived in the spaces between. He traversed the asphalt lot, walking past the lineup of battered pickup trucks, aging sedans, and family minivans equipped with child safety seats in the back. Not a single person swiveled their head to gawk at him, not due to a lack of recognition, but because in places like Ohio, staring at your neighbor is simply bad manners. He fired up his engine and merged seamlessly into the sluggish afternoon traffic, pointing his vehicle in the exact same direction as everybody else. From the rearview mirror, he appeared entirely indistinguishable from any other weary citizen heading home after a demanding, long day. He looked quite simply exactly like them.